Welcome to the Fundamental Health Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Paul Saladino. This podcast is the result of my relentless search to understand and correct the roots of chronic disease and illness. In this podcast, I will share with you everything I have learned about how to live the most healthy and radical life possible. Thanks for joining me on this journey. What is up, you guys? Welcome to the Remembering. If you've heard me talk about this recently, it's something that's been on my mind a lot. The remembering is the best way that I've personally been able to encapsulate, to summarize, to crystallize kind of the emotions that I've had recently around what we're all doing here. What we're all doing as we're looking for an ancestral diet, what we're all doing as we're looking for an ancestral way of life. I really believe that we are trying to remember, that we are trying to shed the amnesia of the past, shed the amnesia of the present, 2020, and remember who we are as humans. It's much bigger than a carnivore diet, than a nose-to-tail carnivore diet, than an animal-based diet, all of which I think are optimal diets for humans, but only encapsulate, only really start to address the dietary piece. And as we all know, it's much bigger than the dietary piece. It's about remembering who we are as humans so that we can live as well as possible during the short amount of time we have on this earth. I recently got to spend a couple of days at White Oak Pastures, one of my favorite farms, a regenerative farm in Georgia, and I was reminded at how beautiful regenerative agriculture is. And being a part of an ecosystem, seeing animals graze properly with birds and seeing soil that is healthy, it's really moving. It's part of the remembering, understanding how we interact with the land, how best to interact with the land in 2020, and how our ancestors would have interacted with the land. Regenerative agriculture mimics these ancient ancestral ecosystems, the way that we would have gathered animals. And that's what we support at Heart and Soil. So the soil part of Heart and Soil is regenerative agriculture. All of our supplements are sourced from regenerative farms in New Zealand. We're developing a United States-based supply chain. We've got some exciting stuff in the pipeline happening with that really soon. But the heart of Heart and Soil is sort of my heart, my deepest soul desire to help as many people as possible benefit from the nutrition found in organs, found in animal foods eaten nose to tail, these precious organs that are often left out of our diets. And the soil part is doing it in the right way, being part of the remembering in that way as well, and treating animals properly, treating the land properly, because we belong to the land. That's another one of the quotes that I love that is on our website. So Heart and Soil is who we are. That is what we do. And really, Heart and Soil is a huge part of the remembering for me as well. That's pretty cool. So on the Heart and Soil front, the exciting news is that we've got 2 new products coming out this week. This podcast is released on Tuesday. On Thursday, we will have Blood Builder and Histamine and Immune out. So get ready for that, you guys. We're super excited about desiccated blood and spleen and liver, the only supplement of its kind in Blood Builder, and Histamine and Immune coming just in time for allergy and respiratory virus season in the fall. I've written a lot about histamine sensitivity, recently done some videos about it. All of those are found at the Heart and Soil website, heartandsoil.co, heartandsoil.co. So if we can help you get more nutrition, if we can be a part of your remembering, that would be an honor for me to be a part of your remembering. Let me know how I can support you. You can always email me, Dr. Paul, drpaul, at heartandsoil.co, heartandsoil.co if you have questions. But it's an honor and a privilege to be able to be a part of your remembering and helping you reclaim your ancestral birthright to radical health. This week on the podcast is my friend, Dr. Chris Knobbe, who is an amazing gentleman. And this is a really great podcast, you guys. Chris Knobbe, actually, I'm saying it wrong already, Kenobi, as I say in the beginning. This is Obi-Wan Kenobi, naming. And so Dr. Knobbe is an ophthalmologist. He completed his residency in 1994 after at the University of Colorado Health Sciences Center in ophthalmology. He's been board certified. And he asked a question many, many years ago: what is causing Westernized disease? What is causing chronic disease? He was specifically looking at macular degeneration and began seeing that the patterns of so many chronic diseases mirrored macular degeneration. As you'll hear in this podcast, macular degeneration is when the tissues of the macula, a particularly sensitive region of vision in the retina, the back part of the eye, degrade. What is causing all this? And we get into it. We do a lot of medical detective work in this episode. He's come to a lot of the same conclusions that I have, that processed sugar and wheat are no good, but really vegetable oils are probably the main driver here. And we offer a lot of science. We go through a lot of really cool history. There's definitely a visual portion of this, which can be found at heartandsoil.co on the videos site and on YouTube and everywhere else. So you guys will love this podcast with Dr. Chris Knobbe, and we'll probably do another one soon. But the takeaway is that, holy moly, this is what we remember, that macular degeneration is curable, heart disease is curable, obesity is curable, diabetes is curable, most autoimmune disease is curable by being part of the remembering, by remembering who we are as humans, how we eat, no cetale animal foods, how we are in the world, sunlight, spending time with people in community, playing and being happy. This is what's so cool. These are reversible diseases. We don't need medications if we get to the root. That is the remembering. I want to thank my sponsors this week. Belcampo, man, love these guys. Belcampo.com, Belcampo. I love their meat. They have stew meat on sale right now, you guys. You can use Carnivore MD for 20% off your order and get stew meat so freaking cheap right now. Organic stew meat is on sale. It's going to sell out after this podcast. It's my favorite one. I blanch it in bone broth every day. I eat it with suet. You can get suet there. I eat liver. You can get liver there. You can get heart. You can get tongue. And they have carnivore bundles. They have keto bundles. Belcampo.com. Use the code CarnivoreMD. They make amazing grass-fed, grass-finished, regeneratively raised meat that is certified organic as well in the beautiful lands of Northern California. And Anya Fernald has been on this podcast. Amazing woman. Refer back to that episode if you want to hear from the lead lady, the head cowgirl of Belcampo. Amazing folks doing really good work. Delicious meat. The ribeyes are out of this world as well. Carnivore MD will get you 20% off through the end of October. Woohoo! And like I said earlier, I was just at White Oak Pastures. WhiteOakPastures.com in Georgia is really my homeland. Those are my people, Will and Jenny Harris. It's always good to give them a hug and to see the good people there doing good work. And I'm using the word good a lot because it's really freaking good. The grass is really green. Look at my Instagram. We took some amazing photos there for the cookbook, and I got to see even more than I have in the past how the cows live. And it's an ecosystem. There are thousands of birds flying around. It's a healthy ecosystem. It's amazing. That's how you know they're raised in the right way. You can use the code CarnivoreMD for 10% off your first order at White Oak Pastures. And they are doing a fantastic job to get us all amazing food. If you get the chance, you should go to Bluffton, Georgia and visit. You really should. You can go anytime. We're going to do White Oak Cella next year. We had to cancel it this year because of silly COVID stuff. But they are doing amazing work. They have a support system. They have a sort of you can be a mayor or a citizen. Check it out. They have a way to kind of pay them a yearly fee and guarantee your access to good meat there. They made me a mayor of Bluffton. I have an amazing cutting board to prove it, but check them out, whiteoakpastures.com. Carnivore MD gets you 10% off. I love the meat from there. You will not be disappointed. I also love the folks at Blue Blocks. I am wearing their glasses right now, BLUBLOX. As I'm sitting in front of my computer, I am wearing the clear ones, which are called the Blue Light Plus, and I'm wearing them in the Jasper, but they recently just sent me some other really cool ones. They have 3 different lenses. They have the Blue Light, the Summer Glow, and the Sleep. The Sleep is the orange one. I like the Jasper. They also sent me some other awesome styles. The Blue Light is for the computer. The Summer Glow is like for cloudy days. It reduces anxiety. Go to their website. They have a lot of really cool information based on which wavelengths of light they block out. The Sleep Plus blocks all the green and green and blue wavelengths that are going to disrupt sleep. The Summer Glow and the Blue Light are a little bit less, but they are going to ease the strain on your eyes when you're in front of a computer, and they look really cool. They also have a sleep mask, which they sent me, called the Remedy, which is amazing. And they have new light bulbs out. They have a red and a yellow light bulb, which I'm going to put around the HQ at Heart and Soil. You guys have seen me in red light in my Instagram videos and stuff, and I use red light bulbs, and I'm excited to try their Lumi Sleep Plus and the Lumi Summer Glow light bulbs. And then they have a new red light device called the Hive, which is low EMF, essentially no flicker, and it is going to be $660 and $850 for the red and near infrared therapies. So they're doing amazing stuff. You can use the code CarnivoreMD for 15% off at Blue Box, but I love these guys. They're definitely doing their homework and making really good quality products. Everyone that has bought them on my recommendation has really appreciated them as well. So Love those guys at Blueblocks, blueblocks.com, BLUBLOX. Would never be a podcast shout out without shouting out my folks at Nutrisense.io. You know I love CGMs. My dad has one on. I can't wait to share his results. I've been talking about continuous glucose monitors all the time. Check them out, Nutrisense.io. Get your family a CGM direct to consumer. Change their diet, change their life, change their behavior. That's part of the remembering. And I love the folks at Force of Nature Meats, forceofnature.com. Yet another regeneratively raised meat provider, sourcing meat from the U.S., Rome Ranch, Texas, all kinds of great places. They have organ blends, they have elk, they have venison, things you can't get other places. Forceofnature.com. Check them out. I am so stoked that 3 out of the 4 sponsors on this podcast, or 3 out of the 5, I guess, are regeneratively raised farms. That feels good to be doing that work, and that through Heart and Soil, we are supporting regenerative agriculture as well and developing the U.S.-based supply chain. So you can check us out at heartandsoil.co, heartandsoil.co. You can always email me, Dr. Paul, drpaul, heartandsoil.co. Before we go to the podcast, if you like this podcast, please leave me a review on iTunes. Every month, I'm going to start giving away a signed copy of the book to someone who has left me a review in the previous month. So leave me a review on iTunes, preferably 5 stars, but you can do whatever you need to do. If you don't like my podcast, shoot me an email, let me know what to make better. But I so appreciate your help with that. That helps us reach so many more people. Okay, on to the podcast. Love you all. All right, Dr. Chris Knobbe, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you, Paul. It's a pleasure to be here.
Is that how you say your last name?
Kenobi.
Kenobi. Okay.
Yeah, like Obi-Wan.
I was going to say Obi-Wan Kenobi. Here we
Same
go.
as Star Wars. I'm
you,
not a fan.
How can you not be a fan of Star Wars, Chris?
I am not a fan. I can't even, it's not my thing. I guess I like, stuff that's completely credible. So it's really not my, it's not my thing.
Well, I hope none of you listening will hold it against Chris that he is not a fan of Star Wars, because I am a huge fan of Star Wars. But we'll try and put aside those cinematic differences and talk about some other really cool stuff. But as I said in the introduction, you are an ophthalmologist. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your background, and then we're going to jump right into the meat of the discussion today with age-related macular degeneration or AMD, and then polyunsaturated fats and carbs.
Okay, sure, Paul. So, right, I'm an ophthalmologist. I'm a medical doctor. I went to the University of Colorado School of Medicine. I graduated 30 years ago. This year is 1990. And I completed an ophthalmology residency in Denver, finished in 1994, and then I went into private practice for the next 21 years. And so I was primarily a cataract surgeon. Obviously, I took care of a lot of age-related macular degeneration, glaucoma, things like that. But anyway, just, personally, Paul, I want to share with the audience that I had the development of arthritis myself back in, really probably about 1994 when I finished residency. I was 33 years old and I started developing arthritis, and I was evaluated by numerous colleagues of mine, family physicians, internal medicine doctors, orthopedic surgeons, 2 rheumatologists, and in 2011 I was even started on an immunosuppressant which I took for 1 or 2 days, because the very next day I learned about the paleo diet in 2011, and I basically stopped grains and dairy, and in about 10 days I was something like 80% better with my arthritis. And I had never heard or understood that dietary changes could be beneficial to arthritis or hardly any other chronic disease. And this was so life-changing for me after suffering with arthritis at that point for about 16 years or so. And it just made me want to learn all I could about nutrition, and I had no idea where this would lead me. But what happened was that I started learning on my, just trying to learn everything I could for a couple of years. And in 2013, a couple of years later, I came across the research of Weston A. Price. And I could talk about that. But anyway, but Price connected Westernized processed food diets to many diseases, chronic diseases, or what we might call diseases of civilization, or Westernized disease, as you know. And so when I understood that, Paul, in late 2013, I started to understand that man-made, processed, nutrient-deficient, toxic foods are driving so much chronic disease, like heart disease, hypertension, stroke, cancers, type 2 diabetes, metabolic syndrome, obesity, on and on. It was at that point that I questioned whether or not the same man-made processed foods might be driving age-related macular degeneration, AMD, which is the leading cause of irreversible vision loss and blindness in people over the age of 65 worldwide. And so I was still in practice. I worked on that for about a year and a half until early 2015, and I felt I had enough evidence that I wanted to pursue this full time. And I actually left practice in 2015 and pursued this full time, and eventually published a book and a scientific paper and started a foundation in this regard. And so now for over 5 years, this is what I've been doing full time.
It's awesome. And what's so cool is that I've had cardiologists on the show, and I've had other types of physicians on the show, and now we have an ophthalmologist on the show, and we are starting to see that, as I talked about in the past, there are so many diseases that Western medicine faces, whether it's ophthalmologic disease, eye diseases, macular degeneration, or diabetes, or heart disease, or autoimmune thyroid disease, autoimmune arthropathy like you had. And as you and I were both trained in medical school to think that these are all different things. These are all different diseases because they have different medications that treat them, because there are different pharmaceuticals from different pharmaceutical companies that treat them. And so from a pharmaceutical centric model, these are all different diseases. That was the reason that I went back to medical school after I was a physician assistant, because that didn't resonate with me. And I think what's so cool is we're all beginning to realize these are not different diseases. These are the same underlying pathologies manifested differently in different people. And that's what's so cool, because then you start to think, okay, if this is the same pathology underlying these diseases, that's really exciting, because then we think maybe we can change this in a positive way. And it starts to make pharmaceuticals take a backseat as we start to look for the root cause and then the root solution. And I think when people from disparate types of medicine end up with similar ideas about what is causing things, that's what gets me really excited. And that's what we're going to talk about today, because I first heard about your research with macular degeneration and polyunsaturated fats, and I thought that is really cool. I haven't heard any other ophthalmologists talk about polyunsaturated fats, but it's totally possible. And I'm of the opinion, more and more, the strong belief that the majority of the chronic disease that limits our quality of life as humans is related to metabolic dysfunction. And all right, sorry guys, we had a little camera malfunction in the middle of the podcast, so I had to pause and change the camera. But as I was saying, the reason I went back to medical school after being a PA was that I wasn't satisfied with the mainstream medical model. And it's so cool when doctors from disparate fields can come to the same conclusions about what is causing chronic disease. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So Chris, why don't you tell us about macular degeneration? I always thought ophthalmology was really cool when I was in medical school. And it was definitely one of the specialties that I was considering. But for a lot of people who don't have people in their family who have macular degeneration, they don't know what this is. Tell us about macular degeneration and then walk us through the history of this, because I want to review this 2017 paper that you published that you sent me. And in this paper, you talk a lot about the natural history of macular degeneration and how it parallels the natural history of many chronic diseases. So tell us about macular degeneration, what it is, what it looks like to you as an ophthalmologist. And then let's talk about the natural history of it and what we know about the incidence of macular degeneration over the last 150 plus years and how we can start to do some detective work around that.
Okay, sure. So the macula is the central retina, and it's responsible for approximately the central 10 degrees of vision. And so this is what, you know, when you're reading something or you're driving, you know, viewing a stop sign or somebody's face, that image lands on the macula, the central retina. And that is, of course, the most important part of the retina because that's where your central vision is. And unfortunately, that area is the most likely to degenerate as we age. I'll kind of put that in quotes. And if that area degenerates, then you begin to have deterioration of your central vision. And ultimately, if it's severe enough, there are different kinds, dry and wet, but we don't need to necessarily get into that right now. But if it degenerates severely enough, then a person will lose their central vision. And so when I hypothesized to myself back in 2013 that, you know, processed foods might be driving age-related macular degeneration, I knew that I had already begun to understand how processed foods had entered the food system in the last 150 years. And so, but anyway, I knew, Paul, that macular degeneration would have to have been rare at one point. And so I thought, well, this will be easy. I'll, you know, pull up some paper that tells us about the history of macular degeneration. And it'll all, you know, this will take me 30 minutes or a couple hours to figure out, right? And I was shocked to find out that I couldn't find any papers on the history of macular degeneration. Just like almost all these other chronic diseases, it's really hard to get that history because it's not taught in medical schools. Allopathic orthodox medicine really doesn't teach the history of these diseases. So anyway, so what I found out, Paul, was that macular degeneration, and I didn't know this, macular degeneration was discoverable in 1851 because of the genius of this physician and physicist by the name of Hermann von Helmholtz. So von Helmholtz was a German-born physician and just a genius kind of guy. At the age of 29, he designed the ophthalmoscope, which allows us to look into the back of the retina. And he published this design. And by the way, I say he's genius because he designed this, which is a pretty darn optically complicated instrument. It takes a lot of knowledge of optical physics to understand the ophthalmoscope. And he designed this with what he called high school physics knowledge of optics. Isn't that crazy? And but anyway, so so he published a little book on this, and this technology spread around the world. It was in use all around the world within a decade. And ophthalmologists began to produce atlases of the retina for the first time in the 1850s. They began retinal photography in 1858. Numerous ophthalmoscopes began to be developed, but it was 23 years would go by before the very first cases of macular degeneration were ever described. And that was by Jonathan Hutchinson, a British ophthalmologist in London, England. He described what looks like 4 cases. He didn't show any pictures. And so there was another 11 years of silence on macular degeneration until 1885 when Otto Haab, a German ophthalmologist, spoke about macular degeneration in a lecture. And then in 1895, Otto Haab published a paper in which he'd reviewed 50,000 ophthalmic patient medical records and determined that macular degeneration was as rare as traumatic maculopathy and myopic maculopathy. All right, Paul, those are extremely rare disorders even today, and myopia is much more common today. But nevertheless, in other words, I've seen several of those, myopic macular degeneration and traumatic macular degeneration, from trauma in my entire career. Whereas, we see huge numbers of macular degeneration today. But anyway, so now, if you look back at, if you keep going, like 1914, an ophthalmologist published a book on the history of ophthalmology. That 1914 text doesn't have anything about macular degeneration in it. 1927, Sir Stuart Duke Elder, one of the most prominent ophthalmologists, in history, published his first comprehensive textbook of ophthalmology, 1927. Macular degeneration wasn't mentioned. All these books, papers, and most of them don't have anything about it, or there's the equivalent of one sentence. But by 1940, Duke Elder, Sir Stuart Duke Elder, ophthalmologist in London, England, he, in his textbook series of 1940, he dedicated 13 pages to the condition of macular degeneration, 17 images, 6 of which were in full color, and he called macular degeneration a common cause of failure in central vision in old people. Now this was, I don't even think he knew what macular degeneration was in 1927. Never mentioned it. Entire book, 340 pages. 1940, it's becoming common. 1973 to 75, the Framingham study in Massachusetts, 8.8% of people over the age of 52 now have macular degeneration in the US, and 27.9% of those over age 75 have the disease. That totals around 4.5 million people. So we went from, so there's an 80-year period essentially, and I've just skimmed the surface here, Paul, but 80-year period, 1851 to about 1930, where there was no more than 50 cases of macular degeneration in all the world's literature, okay? 50 cases, probably half of those weren't even macular degeneration. They were other conditions that would look the same in the end result, okay? In the next 90 years, okay, so we went from 1930 to today. Well, today, I'm just gonna jump forward, 196 million people in the world with macular degeneration.
Diagnosed.
2040, we're supposed to have 288 million people with macular degeneration. And I want to tell you that by 2006, the World Health Organization determined that around 1.95 million people are blind in both eyes, due to macular degeneration. Almost 2 million. If you do the math, this turns out to be somewhere in the range of 540 people per day going blind. In other words, they've already lost vision in their first eye due to macular degeneration, and then today they will lose vision in their second eye, making them bilaterally blind. They'll have huge central blind areas in their vision. And so anyway, that's basically the history right there. It was an incredibly rare disorder. Like I said, 80-year period where we had less than 50 cases in all the world's literature. And believe me, they were looking. I've read all the textbooks. The next 90 years, we have now 196 million people. Well, this is really what we see with heart disease and with cancer and with type 2 diabetes and metabolic syndrome and obesity, and we can go through those if you want to, because I've investigated the history of those. But they will, and then we can, talk about how the diet has changed over that time, Paul, if you want to go, if you want me to go through that. But in a nutshell, I will say that here's what's happened is if I'll just hit the highlights here. In that period of time, the entire diet has almost become 75% processed. In other words, So there's four things basically that have changed in 200 years, and it's sugar, refined wheat flour or refined cereal grains, which are nutrient deficient, vegetable oils, which we didn't have, and trans fats. And between 1866 and 2009, we went basically from almost zero processed foods. The only thing we had in 1865 was sugar in really small quantities. And by 2009, 63% of the American diet is processed food, and 75% of Americans' diet is 63% would be considered ultra processed, 75% is processed. The world's diet now is considered 75% processed food, meaning it's mostly made up of those four ingredients: sugars, refined wheat flour, vegetable oils, and trans fats. Those are nutrient deficient, and then there's a great deal of toxicity associated, particularly with the seed oils, with the trans fats, and if it's high enough, the fructose component of sugar. So you put all that together and you have a toxic milieu. You have a toxic diet that is, driving pro-oxidative, pro-inflammatory, toxic, and nutrient deficient, meaning it's deficient in the vitamins and minerals that are so incredibly important to our health and to, not only to our growth, but to our health in adulthood.
And I think that if medical and nutritional history were overlaid like this in medical school, medical students would wake up in ways that they never have. And
Right.
These to me are the most interesting pieces of the detective story, because I really think that's what we've become as medical detectives. You and I and many other physicians now are medical detectives. We are looking at an epidemic, a pandemic of chronic disease. And so I think about it in much the same way. If you look at the incidence of chronic disease, pick any chronic disease: heart disease, stroke, Alzheimer's disease, cancer, diabetes, obesity, age-related macular degeneration, which happens to young people too, they're all tracking in the same way. Essentially unheard of 150 years ago, essentially unheard of in indigenous cultures that live without processed foods, and yet rampant in Westernized culture. And if you look at the rates of obesity, I've spoken about this before, obesity and overweight, 70% of the US population, 13 to 14% diabetes, it's rising in Asia, heart disease is rising, everything is skyrocketing in the last 100 to 150 years. So as detectives, as thinking people who are trying to reverse engineer all this, we have to look at this. As physicians, this is what's crazy. As physicians, many of our colleagues are not doing this. We are bought and sold into a pharmaceutical-centric paradigm, which doesn't challenge us to look at the medical history. But if you stick your head up for enough time and you think about this, it's very clear there is something going on. Something has changed. But I think this is a very important baseline to establish that indigenous cultures, and we're going to talk about a lot of them today. We're going to talk about the Tokelauans. We're going to talk about Catawbans. We're going to talk about the Maasai. We can talk about the Tukasinta. We can talk about the Pima Indians before they had the introduction of processed seed oils and processed grains into their diet. These people, they are still living on the planet in some places. The Hadza, they are generally free. And I want to make this very clear. These are not diseases of aging. These are diseases of chronic just Westernized diets. And so what does that mean? That means, as you said, there are really four major suspects. This is like the movie, The Usual Suspects. And I feel like that's exactly what we have, is we have a lineup, and that's a good start. We have four major suspects, and perhaps I'm overly zealous to try and pick out the one that's really causing the issue, and we can talk about what you and I think that might be. But I really think about that movie, The Usual Suspects, more and more. This is who is Kaiser Soze. If you guys haven't seen that movie, I'll put a link to it in the show notes, but you should watch it. Basically, it's your criminal lineup, and everyone, mostly everyone, not everyone, mostly everyone can point to those three or four things: processed sugar, processed grains, processed seed oils, and trans fats, and say, what is really causing, and they're all probably causing the issue to some extent, but what is the major driver is my interest, because if we say to people, stop eating processed foods, it doesn't work.
Right.
We've been doing that for decades now. And you hear that people saying that all the time. It's our processed food consumption. It's our processed food consumption. And then every group is starting to have a piece of that they get focused on. And perhaps I'm guilty of that as well, but I try not to be. You know, low carb is saying it's the carbohydrates, it's the carbohydrates. And they're starting to conflate all carbohydrates with processed carbohydrates and excess consumption of fructose. And I want to talk about that today as well, and why I don't think that fructose is harmful within normal physiologic levels. As you suggested, at super physiologic levels, which are easily achievable by consuming high fructose corn syrup, I think it could be possibly dangerous based on the differences between fructolysis and glycolysis, or fructolysis and glycolysis, which we're going to talk about. But I think that it's important that we look at these and we really understand what the major drivers are, so that we can help people make a change. And the more and more that I'm in this space, I don't think it's the carbs, and you're going to get into it. Especially, I don't think it's the carbs when non-processed carbohydrates, reasonable amounts of fruit, honey, squash, things like that our ancestors have been eating for long amounts of time, get lumped in to the other foods, and they're all demonized together. That bothers me. But I love that you're drawing these parallels between all of these chronic diseases. And indeed, in 1897, as you say in your paper, which we're going to review, William Osler didn't really even mention heart attacks. These are rare. And I've spoken about this on previous podcasts with other podcast guests. Listen to the podcast with Nina Teicholz if you guys are curious. You know, heart attacks were not a thing until the 1950s when Eisenhower had his heart attack. But in medical literature, they really weren't a thing 150 years ago. Then something happened. So Western medicine can no longer deny this. Something happened. What is that thing that happened? You hinted at it earlier. I think Weston Price hinted at it originally and said, it's these diseases of civilization. And what are these indigenous cultures, these indigenous people doing as they're transitioning from their old ways of life to the new ways of life? They're eating more processed sugar, they're eating more processed grain, and they're eating more vegetable oils. Trans fats didn't come along until a little bit after Weston Price, but we can dig into all of that. So it's a very interesting sort of idea about all of it. I just want to make sure that everyone understands what we're talking about with macular degeneration today. So really, Chris is the expert with this, but I'll try and explain a little bit of it. Here's the eye. There's all these different parts of the eye. When we're talking about the retina, we're talking about the back of the eye, and there are multiple blood vessels here. It's both arteries and veins in the back of the eye, and there's an optic nerve, and there are different parts. And there's the macula. This is the macular degeneration. And what happens in macular degeneration, Chris, if I'm saying this right, is that part of the eye is really falling apart. It's really getting damaged for a lot of the reasons we'll be talking about today, but that is where our bodies process the central vision. And good old Wikipedia here, you can see this is the way the macula looks when you look through an ophthalmoscope. Now, any medical student or physician listening to this will have shudders of flashbacks, because ophthalmoscopes are the bane of many of our existences. They're challenging. We all sort of pretend that we can see the retina in medical school and residency when we're challenged to look at it. And if you have a patient with hypertension during your internal medicine rotations, they'll say, did you look at his retina? And you say, oh yeah, I looked at it. It was fine. It's really hard to see unless you're an ophthalmologist, but you can see these are not normal. These spots, are these drusen? We'll talk about what drusen are. Would you consider these to be drusen?
Yes.
And we'll talk about that. But this is the retina. This is what we consider to be sort of the optic disc, where the optic nerve is coming in. You can see the blood vessels going into the retina, and then the macula. Would you consider this right here to be the macula that I'm showing, Chris?
Everything between the big vessels there
is the macula.
That.
Okay, that's the macula. And as Wikipedia shows here, when the macula degenerates, when this really important retinal epithelium degenerates, you lose central vision. And that is what we are talking about. And of course, what does Western medicine say is going on here? Well, it's a combination of bad genetics, and we don't really know what's going on. And so for Chris and others to start saying, hey, this is preventable, this is related to diet, is pretty striking. So just tell us a little bit about drusen and what you see in people who have macular degeneration, and then we can get into what you think is causing this.
Okay, well, so I don't know that I could do any better job of describing that other than what you already saw there. I mean, picture's worth 1,000 words. One of the things I want to say, Paul, before we get off subject here is that, there are many parallels between coronary heart disease and age-related macular degeneration, AMD. And we've known this for a long time. Of course, there are associations with between macular degeneration and some of these other chronic diseases like obesity, if we want to call that a chronic disease,
I would.
metabolic syndrome to a degree, and heart disease. And with respect to heart disease, in the 19th century, there was 8 papers on coronary heart disease in that entire century, 1800 and 1900. 2 of those were definite thrombotic events. In other words, they were basically definite heart attack-like papers, myocardial infarction. Yeah, Sir William Osler in 1897, he published a paper where he reviewed his previous 21 years of hospital experience. This was, so if you think about it, this was 1876 to 1897, and he was aware of about 6 cases of angina, the chest pain that might accompany coronary artery disease. He had never seen a heart attack, all right? Never seen a myocardial infarction, MI. 13 years later, in 1910, he spoke in London, England, at a medical conference there, and he described another, between 1897 and 1910, in that 13-year period, he was aware of an additional 208 cases of angina, but yet he had still never seen a heart attack. So from 1876 to 1910, this is one of the most famous physicians in the world. He had never seen a heart attack. And this is clear from his textbooks from the 1890s. He wasn't aware of any heart attacks. Well, neither was the world. And in fact, 1912, James Herrick published the first known myocardial infarction, MI, heart attack in the United States, 1912, documented with autopsy evidence. Nobody even took it seriously, Paul, for about a decade. No one listened. Nobody made a big deal of it because they weren't aware of what this was. MI was virtually unknown, but yet by the 1930s, all of a sudden in the United States, coronary artery heart disease becomes the leading cause of death. And so it was, people were entirely unaware of this in 1910, and yet by 2010, 32.1% of Americans are dying of heart disease. You have to say why? What changed? And it's so the parallels, they're almost identical with macular degeneration. You see the same thing, an incredible rarity of this disorder in the 19th century. It's the same thing with type 2 diabetes and obesity, and we can go through some of those numbers if you want to, and even cancer. So let me just say this real quick. Cancer in 1811, so there's data that shows that in the town of Boston, it's funny to call it a town, but it was about 30,000 people in 1811, and they have these statistics on the causes of death. Well, 5 of 942 people died of cancer in Boston in 1811. That's 1 in 188 deaths. By 1900, the prevalence of cancer caused 5.7 or 5.8% of deaths. It was 1 in 17. All right, so by 2010, we're at 31.2%. So again, it's almost 1 in 3. So we went from, in 1811, 1 in 188 people died of cancer, to 1900, 1 in 17, to 2010, 1 in 3.
Striking.
Why? You have to say why.
Why?
It's not because we're living longer. That's, and that's a whole other talk, really. But throughout history, people have always lived into their 70s and 80s and beyond, as long as they survive childhood. And I'll just say this very quickly, Paul, is that what people don't understand when they say, well, we didn't live as long because, the average age of death in the United States was 49.3 years roughly in 1900. That's because in the year 1800, 43.3% of the world's children didn't survive to see their 5th birthday. In 1900, 36.2% of the world's children didn't survive to see their 5th birthday. And in 1900, 4% of women died in childbirth. So you have this huge death rate in childhood, which, which has changed drastically. By 2010, we're down to all of the developed nations are under 1% mortality. So we went from 1900 to 36.2% in the world of children died before their 5th birthday. 2010, at least all of the nations, all of the world is essentially under 5%, and all the developed nations under 1% mortality. So this is what I've said. So if a man lives to be 80 years old and his wife lives to be 70 and their child dies in infancy, the average age of death for those three, the life expectancy at birth for those three, that population of three, it's 50 years, right? It's 150 divided by 3, it's 50 years. Well, that's where the world was. And if you look back, at all the world's population, this is what you see. Childhood mortality was extremely high until about a century ago. Even in developed nations, like in 1900 in the U.S., I think it was around 25% or so of our children died before their 5th birthday. So anyway, let me say one other. I'm going to give these statistics on obesity because it tracks the same. And let me just say this. So a guy by the name of Scott Allen Carson evaluated 19th century obesity in men age 18 to 80. They were prisoners in Texas and Nebraska. The reason they know their BMI, their body mass index, is because they took their height and weight when they were taken into prison. And so he calculated in the late 19th century, so mostly between 1830s and 1900, that obesity was 1.2% in America, at least in men, age 18 to 80, right? So the next data we have is in the US is 13% obesity in 1960. So we look back and a lot of people say, we were extremely lean in 1960. Well, not really. Obesity had already risen 11-fold. So it remained about 13% till 1980. And then 1988, I think it was, something like, here I've got the data, 23% in 1988, 34.3% by 2005, 35.7% 2011, 39.8% obesity, basically 40% by 2015, 4 out of 10 adult Americans obese. And a recent paper that came out in New England Journal of Medicine, I believe it was, we're on target to be 50% obesity by 2030. But if you just look at the data between 1900 and 2015, obesity has risen 33-fold. Again, why? So people say, well, obesity is the problem. No, obesity runs with all these diseases, right? It's not causing these diseases. They're all caused by the same thing: obesity, cancer, heart disease, stroke, hypertension, type 2 diabetes, metabolic syndrome, macular degeneration. They all track accordingly. They've all gone from mostly rarity in the 19th century when we didn't have these foods to extremely common disorders today.
The medical history correlated with the nutritional history is revealing. I think it's incontrovertible, and I wish it were taught in medical school. And I want to record this and broadcast it to every single medical student all over the world, because you can't ignore this correlation. And it really starts to make all of the pharmacentrism look a little bit weak, because why are we doing that? We know what's causing this. We know how to reverse it. We know how to do this without drugs. And I love that you brought up life expectancy. That is such a straw man argument, and it's absolutely based on infant mortality and childhood mortality. If you look at indigenous cultures, I've talked about this previously on the podcast with James Clement when we talked about squaring of the morbidity curve, and many others on this podcast. Chris Ryan talks about this in Civilized to Death. If you look at indigenous cultures, if you look at free living humans who are not domesticated, This is the
Right.
remembering, you guys. Free living humans who have not had the amnesia of 2020, people who remember what it is to be a human, you will see that the life expectancy, they live until their 70s or 80s. They live the same amount of time as us, and they live without chronic disease, but their life expectancy is skewed by higher rates of infant mortality. Why infant mortality and childhood mortality is higher is a whole separate conversation that probably has to do a little bit with sanitation, resources, poisonous snakes, things like this, but it doesn't talk about chronic disease. What we were talking about here is chronic disease killing humans. Kids and babies don't die from chronic disease. They die from infections. They die from falling off of cliffs. They die from dangerous things in the wilderness. They die from snake bites or getting, other horrible deaths that are tragic, but they do not die from chronic disease. When we're looking at chronic disease taking human lives, we see that in 1900 and 1850, we lived essentially the same amount of time as we do today, and probably even better than we do today. And the ancestral groups that parallel us, the indigenous cultures, the hunter-gatherers, certainly live the same amount of time if you account for all the infant mortality. Now, here's a question for you, Chris. Let's go back to 1850 or even 1800, when all of these diseases are rare. Did people eat carbohydrates then?
Oh, of course.
Absolutely.
They were huge.
Yeah, we'll talk about it. Wait a minute.
They were huge.
Let me ask you this, Chris. In 1900, what percentage of the fat in our diet was animal fat?
99+%.
99%, and yet no chronic disease, right?
Right. So yeah, let me hit that really quickly. So the entire world had never seen a polyunsaturated vegetable oil. At least I would say 99.9+% of the world had never seen a polyunsaturated fatty acid type vegetable oil, what we call vegetable oils, seed oils.
Seed oils.
What some have called factory fats, which I think is also a good term to describe these, but the world had never seen these. So the good old US of A introduced cottonseed oil in 1866, right after the American Civil War ended, because had previously been used as machine oil. It had been used primarily as lamp oil, and then they started using it as fertilizer and then cattle feed, and they didn't kill the cattle. So they started adulterating our butter and lard with it, and beginning in 1866. And so that was cottonseed oil. And so it remained at very low consumption overall until 1909, when soybean oil was introduced. And that really took off. And then we got all the other polyunsaturated oils, which when I say polyunsaturated, I mean that they have a large constituency of the polyunsaturated fat, which is extremely low in naturally raised animals. But anyway, so then eventually we got, let me just mention that, so there's the polyunsaturated seed oils are basically soybean, corn, canola, cottonseed, rapeseed, grapeseed, sunflower, safflower, and rice bran. Those are the oils that have changed the world. And we didn't have, the whole world didn't have them in 1865. And in the next 145 years, these have largely supplanted and replaced the natural animal fats, lard, butter, and beef tallow. So as you questioned me, in 1900, 99% of the added fats in the diet were animal fat, lard, butter, and beef tallow. By 2005, 86% of the added fats in the diet are coming from vegetable oils. So now people think that, well, I'm not using vegetable oils. You don't ever need to pour even a teaspoon of vegetable oil in any of your foods to get what Americans are getting as of 2010, and that's 80 grams a day. So we went from 0 in 1865 vegetable oils to 80 grams a day in the United States, and that, like I said, that replaced animal fats largely. So I went back and calculated the omega-6, just linoleic acid, which is the primary 18-carbon omega-6 fat in these seed oils. And I determined that what our omega-6 consumption would have been in the United States, approximately based on, you know, a model of 40% of our diet coming from animal fat, which again is beef, you know, pork and chicken and mutton, basically those, but they're all pasture raised.
They're
So
not
our
fed corn and
omega-6
soy.
Right. So our
Not fed corn and
omega-6
soy.
would have been about 2.2 grams per day of linoleic acid alone. Well, by 1909, we had cottonseed oil and soybean oil, and the omega-6 was, and this is published, is 4.84 grams a day. So Tanya Blasbog's research published that. 1999, we're at 18 grams a day. 2008, 29 grams a day. So we went from 2.2 grams of omega-6, which is less than 1% of our total calories, to 29 grams a day, 11.8% of our total calories by 2008. Well, that's a 12-fold increase in our omega-6 consumption in this 145-year period. Now, everybody makes a big deal about Tanya Blasbog's research, that, which I think is important, very important. In that paper, they state that, her group states that soybean oil increased 1,000-fold between 1909 and I think it was 1999, which it indeed did, 1,000-fold. Well, guess what? All these oils between 1866 and today, they've increased infinitely, all of them. We didn't have any of them before. And, you know, again, what parallels all of that is all of this, you know, is obesity, heart disease, macular degeneration, cancer, all of this chronic disease is paralleled by this drastic replacement of our traditional animal fats with these omega-6 rich seed oils. So if you look at traditional animals, most of them, if they're consuming grass, their omega-6 in their fat is something like 1 to 3% range, something like that, and the ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 in their fat is about 1.4 to 1. Whereas the seed oils, many of these, the omega-6 in seed oils is in the range of 20 to 60 or 70% even, somewhere in that range. Like soybean oil, I think is ballpark 54% omega-6. Well, this is extraordinary. We were never meant to have these omega-6 fatty acids in our diet like this. We're meant to accumulate these, and that's what we do. We can talk about that too, Paul, if you want to. But so what happens is these fats accumulate in our fat, and then they drive this pro-oxidative, pro-inflammatory milieu, and they are toxic as well. And we can get into all that if you want to.
Yeah, I love it. I totally agree with you. And we've had a lot of conversations offline in which we've shared our shared disdain for these fats. But if anyone has any questions, the increase in adipose tissue linoleic acid of US adults in the last half century, I've showed this paper before. You can look at the fat tissue of US adults in the last 50 years and see linoleic acid rising 136% in the last 50 years. And as Chris is saying, we do not make linoleic acid in the human body. We also do not make alpha linolenic acid or any of the omega-3s. These are all, quote, essential. But how much are we really supposed to have, and how much did we have evolutionarily? That's been the most interesting part for me, is that there is this evolutionarily inconsistent consumption of omega-6 fatty acids in the human diet in 2020, really over the last 100 years, things that we never would have gotten because we never would have made seed oil. And if we were going to eat seeds, they have much less linoleic acid. And we would just never have access to these foods. Now, as Chris said, I'm talking about corn, canola, safflower, sunflower, peanut, soybean, all kinds of things. I would actually extend the list a little further than Chris does. You said grape. I'm not a fan of peanut either. I'm not a fan of even high oleic safflower or sunflower. We can talk about why those are a problem. But humans would never have taken a seed and crushed it into an oil, even if it's high oleic safflower. And I have concerns about excess oleic acid also in the human diet, in addition to polyunsaturated fats. I don't think it's good for us to eat lots of monounsaturated fats either at the expense of animal saturated fat. But we would never have done this. And I just want to have, maybe I'll just take this moment right now to talk about it. The other oils people think about are olive and avocado. So when I'm talking about this, and I imagine you get the same question, Chris, people say, what oil should I use? And I say, why are you using an oil in general? Why do you need a monounsaturated oil? Everybody wants a salad dressing, I guess. And I think, why are you eating a salad? Number one, there is no really good oil for your salad. I'm sorry. Certainly not high oleic safflower oil. Even though it's high in oleic acid and it's lower in linoleic acid, it's still not good for humans. And I will show some literature that I have that suggests that monounsaturated fat overconsumption is probably not a good thing either. Olive oil is okay, but I'm still not convinced it's totally benign or even good for humans. I think that the pundits, the people who say that olive oil is great for humans are off their rocker. There's no evidence that olive oil is good for us. It's probably the most ancient oil. It's easier to get, but both avocado oil and olive oil are not made in natural ways. You have to cut the avocado up. You have to mash it up. You have to put it in something called, called a maxillator. It does maxillation. You do it at heat. Even though they say it's cold pressed, oftentimes they're above 100 degrees. They spin it. It's in the air for a long amount of time. And you're really messing up the fruit by cutting it up and doing all these processing of it. I don't think humans should be doing that in massive amounts. Why are we eating any of these oils, let alone avocado or olive? These don't make any sense to me. We shouldn't be eating these. I'm not even convinced those are contributing to good health. And then obviously the underlying question is, why are you eating salad? What are you putting those oils on? In 1900, 99% of our oil was animal fat. We ate carbohydrates. They were not processed, and we didn't have chronic disease. So I just want to make that point extremely crystal clear. And I don't think Chris either, we do not believe that non-processed, evolutionarily consistent carbohydrates cause diabetes or obesity. That is ludicrous. That is fear-mongering. I'll just make a point to say that excess fructose in the setting of high fructose corn syrup, sure, you could overconsume it. We know that overconsuming anything is going to be a problem for humans. If you get massive amounts of excess calories, that's going to be problematic because of the differences in fructose and glucose metabolism. Problem. But if you're eating fruit, that's not going to cause problems for most humans. In the setting of diabetes or pre-existing metabolic dysfunction, it could cause problems. But for most people, it's not going to be an issue. I just want to screen share a Wikipedia page that is valuable for people. It has all the vegetable oils. So you can just look up vegetable oil on Wikipedia and you can find all the different types of oils and their content of linoleic acid. You can see avocado is fairly low at 12.5. Again, I'm not convinced we should be pushing in tons of oleic acid in this case, nor am I convinced this is a totally safe oil. Brazil nut oil, canola oil is 18.6. Here's corn, cottonseed, flaxseed, grapeseed, 74.7. That's one everybody used to think was healthy, and it's 75% linoleic acid. Hemp seed oil, 54%. Olive is 9.8. Palm is 9.1. Again, these are still much higher in linoleic acid than animal fat. As Chris said, most ruminants are 1.6 to 1.8% linoleic acid, and monogastric animals, when they're raised on their real species-appropriate diet, are around 5%. We're still looking at massively higher amounts of linoleic acid in these fats. And when they're extracted, they're not stable, in my opinion. This is the problem, is that when you extract these oils, when you process them in any way, I think you're going to be putting yourself at risk. Safflower, or at least high oleic acid safflower, is 12.8. Sesame, 41. Anyway, you guys get the idea. You can look at this page. Standard versus regular sunflower oil. These are all pretty high in linoleic acid. The other thing I want to clarify for a lot of people listening is the smoke point. Smoke point has to do with the amount of free fatty acids in an oil, and it doesn't have to do with how stable that oil is to oxidation. So don't be confused by smoke points. Smoke points basically tell you nothing about how oxidizable, how stable an oil is. You have to do things called like the Ransomat method to look at how stable an oil is, how oxidizable an oil is. The smoke point is only really a metric of free fatty acids in an oil, and it doesn't tell you how stable it is at all. Those are often confused. And as we know, the more double bonds in an oil, the less stable it is. So a monounsaturated oil, like an 18-carbon oleic acid, is going to be problematic even for some people, or I think it's just not something to push into your body. The difference here to highlight is that humans do make oleic acid in our body. When we do de novo lipogenesis, when we convert carbohydrates into fat, we make saturated fat and we make monounsaturated fat. There's an enzyme that converts the saturated fat to the monounsaturated fat. That's called SCD1. So we do make some of that. But an interesting thing is one of the papers that you and I will look at in this podcast, Chris, is the one of the Tokelau Islanders. Maybe we should just pull this one up now. I'll see if I can pull it up. We can look at it. So
let me comment on this.
Yeah.
Okay, so Paul, I agree with you 100%. And I am shocked that people seem to be obsessed with having an oil in their diet. And I don't understand this. I agree with you 100%.
They want to cook
I
in
think
oil.
that one of the best things that everybody could do, this is just low-hanging fruit kind of stuff in your diet, is get rid of all oils. Go back to butter, lard, or beef. Well, and you'd have to get lard or, butter, lard, and beef tallow. All should come from pasture-raised animals. When you consume those would be best. Now, even those that are raised conventionally in CAFOs, concentrated animal feeding operations, would be far better than all of these oils, because as we just reviewed and as Paul showed there, even from Wikipedia, you can see that the polyunsaturated content is extremely high in these. And yes, I agree also that olive oil is, I don't understand why everybody thinks this is so healthy, but I believe that the main reason for this belief system is that people consuming lots of olive oil are doing a lot better than people consuming lots of other vegetable oils. That's the big issue right there. Why? Because as you just saw, I think what Wikipedia showed there was the PUFA, the polyunsaturated fat in olive oil, was 9.8%. But I want to point out that I have a paper that they reviewed 800, they chemically analyzed 800 different olive oils, and they were supposed to be good olive oils, extra virgin olive oil. And the PUFA, Paul, it ranged from 3% to 23%, I believe it was, 23. So that's a huge range, and you can't look at any of these oils and just say, okay, this oil has this amount. You don't know that. I mean, they're all, they obviously range tremendously. So the difference between a 3% PUFA olive oil and a 23%, that is huge, because again, the PUFAs, the omega-6, are going to accumulate in your fat, accumulate in your membrane, your cell membranes, accumulate in your mitochondrial membranes, and that is the setup for disaster. That's the setup for a pathologic and catastrophic lipid peroxidation cascade. This is where all the danger lies, or this is a huge part of it. And so, yes, I think we should just, most people need to get their omega-6 consumption as low as they possibly can, because their omega-6, and we didn't see the graph there, but from Stephan Guyenet's published paper, but in 1959, Americans' linoleic acid in their adipose tissue was 9.1%. And in 2008, their linoleic acid, omega-6, in their fatty acid, in their adipose, their fat tissue, was 21.5%. Well, the Tokelauans, and we can talk about their diet, this is the only population that I'm aware of, Paul, the only study I've ever seen where their linoleic acid in their fat was analyzed. This was 1968, and the Tokelauans' linoleic acid in their fat was 3.8%. So it's getting close to, it's approximating grass-fed cattle, ungulates. I mean, that are out grazing on grass, which, like I said, are down in the 1 to 3% range, something like that in their omega-6. That's where we all should be, is in that range. How are you going to get there? While I'm on the subject, I'm just going to say that the omega-6, the half-life of the omega-6 linoleic acid in our fat, in our adipose, is 600 to 680 days. You might as well just round it off to about 2 years. And so it'll take a number of years to get your linoleic acid down, in your omega-6 down in your fat, in your membranes, in your cell membranes, and in your mitochondria, down to where it needs to be. And the best way to do that is to get these, get the omega-6 as low as you possibly can. And you will do that with animal fats that are traditionally raised on pasture, on grass. 100% grass fed is the way to get there. They cannot be CAFO, concentrated animal feeding operation, raised, because those animals are consuming grains in the form of corn and soy, and they were never meant to eat that. They're meant to eat grass. And when they consume corn and soy, their omega-6 goes quite a ways up. Now, it's, again, that is, eating those would be tremendously better than seed oils, but it's not the best replacement. I mean, it's not the best replacement for seed oils would be traditional animal fats.
And I do have some suspicion or curiosity that consuming well-raised animal fats that are high in things like stearic acid, at the end of this podcast, I'm going to talk about C15 octadecanoic acid, which is an odd chain fatty acid, could potentially replace linoleic acid in the membranes. I've seen it change a little bit faster than those published studies with the half-lives in my clients. I've seen it actually change pretty darn fast when the linoleic acid is replaced by good animal fats. And you can do it. I've done videos in the past, guys. I recently released a controversial thoughts video where I went over my friends' labs, and I'll show my labs. You can look at the linoleic acid in your red blood cells or in your serum. Unfortunately, we don't do fat biopsies regularly, but here's the graph that Chris was talking about from the paper on linoleic acid in the adipose tissue. And you can see it's going from around an average of 10% up to over 25% in the adipose tissue. This is a major problem, considering that most of the Tokelauans, most of the Maasai, most of the indigenous cultures that are studied around here are not even on the graph. The bottom of this graph is 5.
Right.
So most of the indigenous cultures are down here, you guys.
Yeah.
Down here. And you can see this, just, it's incredible. This is one of the reasons that, and I've talked about this with Ivor Cummins on this podcast in the past, this is one of the reasons that epidemiology can be so confusing. If everyone in the population has massive amounts of linoleic acid, even the people eating the least linoleic acid are probably eating too much linoleic acid. So you're not going to see a signal that linoleic acid is necessarily causing disease when you do an epidemiology observational study in the US population in 2010 or 2020, because everybody is eating 5 to 10 times more than they should be. So even the lowest group is probably at a toxic level. And that's very scary. That's the problem with epidemiology. Going back to my concerns about oleic acid, I want to share this study that I've spoken about before, which is done in mice. And I won't spend too much time on this one because I've spoken about it in the past. But if you look at mouse models, if you look at animal models of obesity and visceral fat, it's very clear that stearic acid, saturated fats, 18 carbon saturated fat, this is one of the reasons I got so interested in this, and one of the reasons we developed Firestarter at Hard and Soil. The stearic acid fed to animals reduced visceral fat by 70%, and lean body mass was increased in the stearic acid fed group. But unlike oleic acid and linoleic acid, they're saying here, so both oleic acid and linoleic acid, stearic acid caused programmed cell death in fat cells. What they're saying here is that both oleic acid and linoleic acid did not cause that. And if you look at the data in the mice that were fed large amounts of safflower oil, so there was low-fat diet, stearic acid, corn oil, and safflower oil. Safflower oil is the one I've been talking about a lot recently because Whole30 recently released a series of dressings with high oleic acid safflower oil. And I think there's this confusion that oleic acid is okay for humans in massive amounts, and I'm just not convinced. You'll see here, you can actually visualize the amount of visceral adipose tissue in these mice, and the corn oil group is high in linoleic acid, and the safflower oil group is high in oleic acid, and both of these groups have lots of visceral adipose tissue. I am not convinced that oleic acid is not also allowing our fat cells to grow, just like linoleic acid. From an oxidative perspective, from an ox-lamb, from an oxidative product of linoleic metabolism perspective, from these things like 4-HNE, et cetera, monounsaturates are probably better. But in terms of signaling at the level of the adipocyte, refer back to the podcast that I've done with Brad Marshall and the one I did with Ben Bickman, you can see that oleic acid doesn't look a whole lot better. Here's the weight of the abdominal fat in grams. Low fat, pretty darn high. Stearic acid, really low. Look at corn oil, is high, linoleic acid, but safflower oil was also still high. And this is the stuff that's trying to be sold to us now in dressings and whatnot. And even this is a high oleic acid oil. This is probably not something we should be pushing into our body.
Paul,
yeah.
Let me interject right there, because even though those are high in oleic acid, they're also still high in linoleic acid.
They are. They're
still very high as compared to the stearic acid, the saturated fat group. They would still be very high in linoleic acid, omega-6 linoleic acid. So as you were saying earlier, so if we overconsume carbohydrates, for example, I mean, our body converts the bulk of those into oleic acid, and then the second huge bulk is saturated fats. And we don't make any omega-6 linoleic acid or omega-3 linolenic acid, as you said. As far as we know, those are the essential fats. But I'm still convinced. Yeah, I agree with you that I'm not so sure about I think the biggest problem is really that we're back to the oils, and the linoleic acid in those is still very high, despite the fact that they're trying to make it, about the oleic, the monounsaturated fat. I think it's primarily about the polyunsaturated fat. And then the other issue is that these oils, they are all dry. They're all converting to toxic aldehydes. I mean, they're causing us to. They have the toxic aldehydes. We can get into this, but or they're being converted into toxic aldehydes pathophysiologically in our bodies, and these are very, very dangerous chemicals in extremely small amounts. Things like 4-hydroxynonenal, which is 4-H&E, malondialdehyde or MDA, 9 and 13 HOD, carboxyethylpyrrole, acrolein. And here's what's interesting: the lipidologists who study all this and analyze how these omega-6 fats, beginning primarily with linoleic acid, how they're being first oxidized to hydroperoxides and then breaking down into these toxic, dangerous aldehydes. There's literally hundreds of them. So I just named a few, maybe 6 or 7 of them, but there's literally hundreds of these different toxic aldehydes, and these are collectively cytotoxic, genotoxic, mutagenic, carcinogenic, atherogenic, and obesogenic. I think I left something out, but they are collectively, in extremely small amounts, extraordinarily toxic and mutagenic and carcinogenic, and driving all of this chronic disease in and of themselves. So we've got 2 major issues, with the omega-6 seed oils, is that they're driving pro-oxidative effects, and they're also toxic. And then let me say one other thing. So even what I would definitely say is healthy oils like coconut oil and probably palm kernel oil, because they're very high in saturated fat and very low in polyunsaturated fat. Let me just say one thing about all the oils: none of them have fat soluble vitamins. And this is another entire area of discussion, but they don't have vitamins A, D, and K2. And these vitamins, which goes clear back to Weston Price's research in the 1930s and 40s, and even sooner than that with E.V. McCollum's research in the 19-teens, that these vitamins are incredibly important to preventing chronic diseases, and we are extraordinarily deficient in these vitamins. And you don't get any of those vitamins from coconut oil, palm kernel, none of them. None of the oils are going to have any of those vitamins at all. You're going to get those back again: butter, lard, beef tallow. Yes, you'll get all 3. And in a good grass-fed butter, you will get enough of those vitamins, probably, if you're consuming it regularly, to help prevent all of this disease. But I calculated on a worldwide basis, I think the average person is getting about 1 teaspoon of butter per day, whereas they're getting about 16 teaspoons of vegetable oil per day. 16 to 1 vegetable oil to butter. Well, I mean, and even that butter is not a good, most of them are not grass fed. They're not a good quality butter. They're coming from a CAFO raised animal, that's been fed, GMO corn and soy, right? So they're they're going to be much lower in those vitamins as well. So that's another entire area of conversation, but it's
all about the fat soluble vitamins.
Important.
Yeah, the fat soluble vitamins and animal fat. And I love what you said. It's tallow primarily is my favorite. I'm not as much of a fan of butter because a lot of people have sensitivities to dairy. And I know you felt better when you got rid of dairy. And butter is going to have some dairy proteins in it, casein, whey, even ghee will have that. If you're not sensitive, then fine, use those, but I still prefer tallow. I'm not a fan of lard. We touched on this because it's almost impossible in 2020 to find lard from a pig that is not fed lots of corn and soy. You guys can listen to the previous episode with Brad Marshall if you have questions about that. But I want to share this cool paper I found from Chris Ramsden, who is the hero of Minnesota coronary experiment, Sydney Diet Heart study. So effective diets enriched in linoleic acid and its peroxidation products on brain fatty acids, oxylipins, and aldehydes in mice. This is what Chris is talking about. I've talked about this in the past. I'm going to have Tucker Goodrich on the podcast soon and talk more about these oxlams, these oxidized linoleic acid metabolites and reactive aldehydes. Chris mentioned 4-hydroxy-2-nonanol, 4-HNE, 9 and 13-HODE. Basically, what they found in the study was that increasing dietary linoleic acid significantly increased oxidative products of linoleic acid metabolism in the brain, and it decreased omega-3 fatty acids. Now, we know this balance between 4 and 6 is important, and when you increase oxlams in the brain, that's a very bad thing, you guys. It's a very bad thing. Now, this is an animal model, but I don't see a reason why this would not also be happening in humans. I think it would be interesting if we could study this in humans, but as you can imagine, studying oxidative products of linoleic metabolism in living human brains would be problematic. Now, if you guys had any questions about the magic of beef tallow, I want to show you this paper. Beef tallow increases apoptosis and decreases aberrant crypt foci formation relative to soybean oil in the rat colon. Basically, they gave rats colon cancer. They gave rats colon cancer by using a chemical called dimethylhydrazine, and they were fed either casein or beef protein as the protein source, and soybean oil or tallow as the fat source in a 2x2 factorial design for 9 weeks. And what do you think they found? They found that the number of precancerous lesions was much lower in the tallow group and much higher in the soybean oil group. Whether they fed the rats casein or beef protein didn't make a difference. Again, this is one of these interventional studies with beef protein showing that it does not increase colon cancer. This is another thing that gets so ignored in the face of epidemiology. But in this study, they're specifically studying tallow. This is why we made Firestarter, you guys, because we want you to get more tallow. We want it to be portable and easy to get. It's a high stearic acid fat that's super freaking healthy for humans. It decreases colon cancer in a rat model of dimethylhydrazine-induced aberrant crypt foci. So that is really cool as well. The last piece of this that I want to share is something else that I've been geeking out on recently, and we probably don't have time to get into all of it today, but it is relevant to these oxylipins, to these reactive aldehydes, to these oxidative products of linoleic acid metabolism. So if you guys were listening to the podcast that I did 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago with Ben Bickman, one of the things that seems to happen when we get metabolic dysfunction, when we get chronic disease, is impaired adipocyte sort of division, cell division. We get hypertrophy rather than hyperplasia of the adipocytes. When the adipocytes, when the fat cells get to be too big, then that is where they get inflamed. You get macrophage infiltration into the fat cells. You get what are called crowns of macrophages in the fat cells. But big fat cells that can't divide, that is where the fat cells become sick. So this is impaired adipocyte sort of division. And what's interesting is that what is causing the adipocytes to become too big and not to divide? 4-HNE is one of the things that is implicated here. So 4-hydroxynonenal, one of these reactive aldehyde products of linoleic acid metabolism, appears to break the division, the sort of the hyperplasia ability of adipocytes. So I'll repeat that. When in people who have diabetes, this is well documented, I'll talk about this much more in the future, we see adipocyte pathology where the adipocytes, the fat cells, are too big. If we can expand the fat cell mass and get more fat cells that are smaller, people don't get metabolic dysfunction. All right. This is what we saw in the sumo wrestler studies that I talked about earlier. You can be fat, but if you have lots of small fat cells, you're not going to get inflammation. You're not going to get metabolic dysfunction. You're not going to get, quote, insulin resistance. I don't like that term. What prevents the fat cells from dividing? What makes the fat cells too big? What is causing this pathological adipocyte hypertrophy? 4-HNE is one of the things. So role of physiologic levels of 4-HNE on adipocyte biology, implications for obesity and metabolic syndrome. So our studies demonstrate that acute or repeated exposure of adipocytes with physiological low concentrations of hydroxynonenal is sufficient to promote subsequent oxidative stress, impaired adipogenesis, that is impaired division of the fat cells, alter expression of adipokines, and increase lipolytic gene expression and increase free fatty acid release. This is a really cool paper that is essentially saying that these products of linoleic acid metabolism are breaking your fat cells. They are one of the causes of your fat cells getting too big and bursting, essentially, when they should be dividing. They prevent our body from dealing with excess calories, and they make us metabolically ill. So that is sort of the cherry on top of the previous conversation with Ben Bickman, but it's relevant to what we're talking about now. Now, I want to show you guys all this paper that Chris has written and let him comment on it before he has to go, because it's an excellent paper.
Paul, let me comment.
Yeah.
Before we go to that, could I?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I want to say that regarding the omega-6 and carcinogenesis, cancer induction, there's so much research about omega-6 and or seed oils driving cancer. And I just want to point out one paper, I don't have it handy here, but it's by Clement Ip, IP, and colleagues, published in 1987. And what they did was they put rats, I believe, or rodents on various levels of omega-6 diets. They began them at 0.5% linoleic acid, which is about as, that's probably the amount that's appropriate or essential. And then they had different diets, increasing by 0.5% in different groups. So, and then they went up to, I think, 8 or 10 or 12%. But what and then they gave these animals a carcinogen. So they gave them a carcinogen, varied only the omega-6 in their diets. And what they found was that as the omega-6 went up, that cancers went up. And there was a threshold at 4.4%. And if they went above 4.4% linoleic acid in their diet, there was no increase in cancer. So here's the implication of that. The entire world almost is now consuming more than 4.4%. Like I said, we're at Americans, omega-6 in 1999 was 7% of the diet. And by 2008, 11.8%, right? And most of the world, including the developing world, is now above 4% of their diet, or 4.4% of their diet as omega-6, right? And so here's what we see, and this drives me crazy, Paul, is that, so you have these researchers that they're trying to look at, they take a population that's all from the United States, right? And they take them and they say, okay, we're going to look at all these factors, how much vegetable oil, how much whatever in their diet, and we're going to try to hold these 8 variables constant and look at one, using fancy statistics like regression analysis is what that really is. You can never do that. And so here's the problem is they're never comparing a population consuming a Westernized diet to a population consuming a native traditional diet without seed oils. They never think to do that. They're just taking a population that's all consuming the noxious agent, if you will, and then trying to figure it out. Well, this is kind of like taking a let's say you're trying to figure out, what causes lung cancer, and it's 1950, and you're drawing your entire population of study from people that 98% of them are smokers, right? And you're going to try to figure this out. They're all getting the noxious agent, right? And this is what it's like. Instead of comparing, like I said, instead of comparing populations consuming a native traditional diet without the processed foods and comparing that to outcomes of people consuming a Westernized diet.
It's the problem. You're right. And if we look at these indigenous cultures, they're eating nose to tail, they're eating organs, they're eating animal foods, they're making animal fat and organs the majority of their diet. They're eating non-processed carbohydrates occasionally. I'll mention a Hadza paper that I've looked at in a little bit, you guys. But yeah, and they never compare those two. They're always comparing sick versus a little less sick.
Yes.
And everybody's swimming in the same dirty water. So I don't know why we think that that's going to be a valuable study, but that's the problem. So I agree with you completely. And if you can you send me the reference for that paper? I'll put it in the show notes at this point so people can look at it.
Yes, absolutely.
Perfect.
Yeah, that's a great paper. And one of the things that Paul and I both should say here, which we both understand, is that if you look at the diets of all of these populations, which you mentioned at the beginning, Paul, I mean, from the Maasai, the Rendili, the Samburu, the Tokelauans, the Catawbans, the Ashe of Paraguay, Eskimos, Inuit, Bolivian Indians, all of these populations that don't have these chronic diseases, they all share one thing in common, and that is that they don't have our processed foods. They don't have refined sugars, refined white flour, vegetable oils, and trans fats. And then they don't get these diseases. They just have these chronic diseases like heart disease, cancer, and so on are just extraordinarily rare. And it's the way we were in the 19th century. We were the same way. I mean, that's the simple
that's the answer.
Yeah.
It's absolutely the answer. And it wraps in so many things. And like I said, saturated fats are not bad for humans. They're good for humans. And I agree with you completely. And the only thing I would add to that is that don't demonize carbohydrates don't lump carbohydrates into the processed sugar thing, because they're not the same, right? There's probably a worsening with high fructose corn syrup because you can overconsume it, but do not lump carbohydrates in there because that's a mistake. And there are a lot of people that we've talked about that we will talk about. I'll probably do a little extra after this podcast after Chris has to leave. I'll talk about the Tokelauans and the Tukasinta and the Maasai. A lot of these cultures consume carbohydrates without any problem. So that's just too much to take it that far. But I want to show you guys Chris's paper. Displacing foods of modern commerce are the primary and proximate cause of age-related macular degeneration, a unifying singular hypothesis. It's a great paper. I want to point out a few things you mentioned in the abstract, and then I'll let you go, that you looked at correlative data. So this is all correlation. We're going to generate hypotheses from that, and we can then test it, and we can look for other studies that have tested these hypotheses, which I believe there are, but the correlations are striking. And one of the most interesting things that I came across when I was reading this paper, Chris, was that the correlative data in 25 nations show that increasing sugar and polyunsaturated vegetable oil consumption is invariably associated with new onset or rising prevalence of age-related macular degeneration, generally within 30 to 40 years of the beginning of increasing consumption of these proxy markers of processed food consumption. This next part was very interesting to me. The correlative data also demonstrate that when sugar consumption is moderate, but harmful vegetable oil consumption remains extremely low or absent, the prevalence of age-related macular degeneration remains rare. And this is sort of what I'm driving at with really trying to put a fine pin on the root cause of these diseases. And I'll repeat that. This is a correlative data, but when sugar consumption is moderate, but harmful vegetable oil is low, age-related macular degeneration remains rare. So I'm not arguing that high fructose corn syrup and processed sugar is good, but I'm not convinced that it's the main problem here, because there are many foods that we eat that have sugar in them, that have fructose in them, like fruit or honey. And these are widely eaten by indigenous cultures. The Hadza consume 15 to 20% of their calories as honey. The Mbuti pygmies at times consume 50 to 80% of their calories as honey, and they don't have chronic sort of degenerative disease. So to say that sugar in all of its forms is the main problem, I think draws too broad a swath. It's not fine enough to say that. Now, I'm not saying high fructose corn syrup is good. It's replacing other nutrient dense foods like, fat soluble vitamins containing animal fats. But to say that sugar is causing this is, I think we can't say that for sure. And I don't think we should fear fructose in reasonable amounts. I know you've got to go. Anything you want to say to wrap us up? And then after we say goodbye to Chris, I will go through a number of studies that I wanted to get in this podcast. So stick around and I will keep talking after Chris has to go.
Okay, first of all, Paul, I'd love to come back. And so yes, I have a hard stop, everybody, that I have to get to an appointment. But I'd like to come back and we could discuss these these cultures, these populations that are consuming native traditional diets and are so incredibly healthy. I feel and believe, based on all the science, just exactly as Paul does, I am not at all convinced sugar is a huge problem. I'm not supporting the consumption of a lot of sugar. It is a displacing food of modern commerce for sure. And if you're consuming a fourth of your diet as sugar, no, that's not good, because you could be consuming other foods in place of that would have nutrients, that would have vitamins and minerals that would be beneficial to you. And so I am a Weston A. Price acolyte to my very core. And so, yes, that is a displacing food of modern commerce. But in comparison to the seed oils, sugar doesn't hold a candle in terms of its detrimental effect. And we see that everywhere. In fact, this is something that we could talk about at length, and I'd like to come back and do that. But if we look at Asians, for example, to take the Japanese, for example, in 1963, 63% of their diet was refined white rice. That is a refined processed food, essentially. And they were incredibly healthy because the rest of their diet made up for it. I mean, it really worked that well because their diet otherwise was not processed, right? And what has happened to the Japanese since is they have replaced their carb consumption went down. Their vegetable oil consumption went up 4.5-fold in the period 1961 to 2007. Same thing with China. Their carb consumption is going down. Their vegetable oil consumption went up 8-fold between 1963 and 2003. And we could look at. There's so many populations we could discuss this, but that consume huge amounts of carbohydrates and pretty significant amounts of sugar, as Paul just reviewed some of them, and were healthy. And what's happening is we see the whole world replacing more and more of their diet with seed oils and getting all of this chronic disease. This is what we see over and over, all over the world.
You said it so well. I love what you said, displacing foods of modern commerce. Neither Chris nor I is arguing that we should make all of our diet white rice. I have major problems with wheat because of the lectins in wheat, and you personally felt much better when you removed wheat. There are lots of things about carbohydrate-containing foods that can be problematic for humans, but I think that one of the curiosities, or one of the things that I've really been turning over in my mind, is the idea that there are ancestrally consistent carbohydrates, seasonal fruit, honey. If you pull the grain off white rice, it's basically just amylose, which is a polymer of glucose. And
right.
Provided that you're not eating excess calories, that may not be bad for humans. In fact, I don't think it is. And so you have to see how your body reacts. I'm not a fan of wheat or wheat flour because of just all the lectins and stuff in that grain, but it's it's things that we cannot ignore. Brad Marshall and I talked about that with regard to Asians. And of course, there's a major change in Asian culture and Asian health over the last 50 years, as we talked about. They've gotten much more diabetes with the advent of seed oil. So they're a perfect example. 1960, they're eating a lot of white rice. They don't have diabetes.
Right.
2010, the rates of diabetes are skyrocketing, and it's the inclusion of vegetable oils. I will actually show a study about that in a moment, you guys. So question for you, Chris. You're eating Weston Price. That I'm almost positive you include organs in your diet. I'm sure you eat nose to tail.
Oh, I absolutely nose to tail. My diet is, as you would call it, Paul, carnivore-ish.
I love it.
Yeah. Yeah. So I actually, one of the things that I found out over the last couple of years really is that I actually do the very best on a strict carnivore diet. Now, I don't currently eat strict carnivore, but I consume very few vegetables and very small amount of fruit. My diet is mostly meat, organ meats, and I am now consuming over the past year raw milk from A2 cattle from a local farm, and I'm doing really well with that. But so raw milk and raw dairy, even some colostrum and of course grass-fed butter, and even some raw yogurt. But anyway, that's where the bulk of my calories is coming from, is meat, organ meats, and dairy, dairy from 100% grass-fed cattle. A2 cattle. I'm going to just say that because that's tolerated by humans. We know that it's less antigenic probably than the A1 variety, which is a different kind of protein. But A2 seems to be better tolerated by humans. By the way, that's what the Maasai warriors were, consuming traditionally, was A2. Their cattle were A2. I think they're basically the equivalent of Jersey cows.
And blood.
Absolutely.
Which is super exciting because we're coming out with a blood supplement at Heart and Soil really soon, but I'll tell you guys about that later. We got actually a blood in a capsule. It's the only one of its kind, but I definitely talk about A2 milk in the carnivore code, you guys. I don't tolerate any dairy, even if it's A2, so be careful with that. But if you do tolerate it, it's eaten by some indigenous cultures, probably just going to be a genetic thing. Chris, I know you got to go. I love this conversation. I'm so appreciative of your time. What is the most radical thing you've done recently?
Oh, gosh. I guess, I'm going to try to keep it to this conversation. I'm going to say that I ate beef heart.
Nice.
For the first time just several weeks ago. I got, so I had, I'd ordered a large portion of grass-fed beef, and I got all the organs, and I'd never had beef heart. Well, I ended up getting a half of a beef heart, and so cooked that, got, beef tongue, and of course, beef liver I eat regularly. But anyway, I just would say that, I think that everybody should be consuming organ meats, particularly liver. Beef liver is extraordinarily high in vitamin A. Chicken liver is a really good source of vitamins A and D. And fish eggs, roe, if you eat sushi, we always get fish roe because they're a great source of vitamins A, D, and K2. But if you think about it, eggs, everybody, they're meant to grow the whole animal. And so they're a brilliant source of tons of nutrition, but all of the vitamins and significant minerals are in there.
And if you got, I love it when people say their most radical thing is eating an organ. And I hope the next time we talk, it'll be you've eaten something new, like pancreas or spleen or something. And if you guys can't eat the fresh organs, you know where to get them at heartandsoil.co. We've got all the desiccated ones for you. Where can people find more of your work about macular degeneration? Where can they reach out to you in the future?
Sure. So we have a website. The company, it's a nonprofit organization, is Cure AMD Foundation. We are at cureamd.org. you can go there, and if you want to reach out directly to me, just go to the contact link and send me an email and I'll respond.
Cool. I'll show that on the screen here. Chris, it's a pleasure having you on. Thanks for coming on, my friend. And I look forward to our future conversations. We've done a lot of good sharing of ideas. And my only regret is this podcast isn't longer, but I'm going to talk about a bunch more stuff in a moment, you guys. So stick around, but I'm gonna let you go. Okay. Have a good day, Chris. I'll talk to you soon.
Okay, Paul, I just got to say to you, thank you so much for what you do. Thank you for having me on, but I want to thank you personally for what you've done and the knowledge that you've brought to us about carnivore and the dangers of plant foods, those risks and benefits. You are one bright, amazing guy, and I give you a ton of credit, as do many others in this field, Paul. And I just want to say personally, from me to you, thank you so much, because you are doing brilliant work too, and I love it. Thank you.
That means the world to me, Chris. It's fun to get to do this work. I'm grateful to get to do it, and yeah, it feels good to know that I can contribute things of value, and we're always learning together. So, have a good day, my man. I'll talk to you soon.
Okay, Paul. Thank you so much. Everybody, take care.
All right, you guys. I am still here. Chris had to go. That was my mulligan. That he didn't have enough time, but I was futzing around with the camera stuff in the beginning and we lost a little time. But I want to share with you guys even more interesting stuff that we didn't get to in that conversation. I love that we highlighted the fact, though, that the Japanese were eating lots of rice. They don't have diabetes. You introduce vegetable oils, it goes crazy. And I actually want to show you guys a graph that illustrates that very well. And that is from a very interesting paper, which is this one, the title of which is quite revealing. And again, all of this will be on the visuals at YouTube or heartandsoil.co. Medicines and vegetable oils as a hidden cause of cardiovascular disease and diabetes. That's about it. 2016 paper. But there's a couple of figures in here that are very telling. The first one is this one. The prevalence of diabetes across countries adjusted for the world standardized age. And you can see here that they have in the graphs that are blue, there is no data regarding sugar consumption. But in the graphs that are colored, you can see the highest high fructose corn syrup consumption is 68 grams per day. The lowest is less than 1.5 grams per day. What you can see by looking at this is there's no data for Saudi Arabia or Kuwait, which are the highest prevalence of diabetes. But Egypt has the third highest prevalence of diabetes, and they are the lowest in high fructose corn syrup. Turkey, there's no data. Mexico has the second highest in high fructose corn syrup. Iraq, there's no data. Canada is high. The US is the highest in high fructose corn syrup data. But then you see India with essentially the exact same rate of diabetes and less than 1.5 grams per day of high fructose corn syrup. So I think this graph just begins to illustrate the correlations between high fructose corn syrup and diabetes are much less strong than we are led to believe. Again, I'm not advocating for high fructose corn syrup. I am advocating for some sanity around the fear mongering that is happening with regard to carbohydrates in this space. This is another graphic that I really want to highlight here. Look at the trend in diabetes in Japan. 1970 goes through the roof. This is what Chris and I were talking about. Before then, it was nothing. Well, here in 1950, 1960, Japanese males and women were eating tons of carbohydrates. That didn't change. Diabetes goes through the roof in the last 50 to 60 years. And what goes up with it? This green line is vegetable oils. Carbohydrate actually went down and diabetes went up. Look at how much carbohydrate they're eating here in 1950. And then it goes down, but diabetes goes through the roof. Again, this is all correlational data, but it starts to point a real strong finger. There is something besides carbohydrates causing the problem here. I'm not advocating for high fructose corn syrup, and I don't want it to be displacing things that are valuable for us, more nutrient-dense meat and organs. But this is the reality, you guys, that carbohydrates do not look to be the main culprit here. We need to show what's really problematic. U.S. sugar intake versus obesity prevalence, 1980 to 2013. You'll see here, this is NHANES data. Obesity is going up. Sugar was going up until 1995, and then it goes down, but obesity keeps rising because you know what? Vegetable oils continue to rise. So to suggest that it's sugar that's causing this doesn't really add up. Now, again, we just need to be careful that we're not over fear-mongering here. I want to share some studies about other cultures that are eating lots of carbohydrates doing just fine. The Tucacinta have the majority of their calories as carbohydrates. You can read this paper. I'll put it in the show notes. Cardiovascular disease and relevant clinical, EKG, radiological, and biological findings of epidemiology studies in a total highland population in Tucacinta, New Guinea. That's a fascinating paper. I want to show this one also of the Tokelau Islanders. There's tons of this. I can go on all day. I'm here all night. Cholesterol, coconuts, and diet on Polynesian atolls, a natural experiment, the Pukapuka and Tokelau Island studies. And what you'll see here is that there is essentially no real vascular disease in any of these populations. The Tokelauans eat 63% of their diet is saturated fat. That's not bad for us, clearly. And the Tokelauans have the Pukapukans have 34% of their diet is saturated fat, neither of which has any major disease. I also want to point out that they eat a lot of their diet as carbohydrates, and they don't have cardiovascular disease, and they also don't get terribly fat. So anyone saying that carbohydrates make you fat or give you diabetes is missing the overall equation. The other thing I thought that was interesting, and this goes back to the monounsaturated fat question, is table 6 comparing the fatty acid composition of the adipose tissue of Tokelauans and Pukapukans and New Zealand Europeans. Look at this, Tokelauans and Pukapukans, the 18:1 is monounsaturated oleic acid, 27.8, 29% in Pukapukans. New Zealand Europeans, 49.4% oleic acid. There's something going on here. If you look at the overall unsaturated fat in the fat tissue of New Zealand Europeans versus these islanders, 63% in New Zealanders versus 47% in the Pukapukans and Tokelauans. And saturated fat, 51% and 52% in the islanders, 34% in New Zealand Europeans in their fatty tissue. So my suspicion is that there is something going on here. And I would hypothesize this is related to excess linoleic acid, and that excess linoleic acid is causing some derangement in the way that saturated versus monounsaturates are being partitioned in the fatty tissue. The takeaway from my perspective, this is just Paul Saladino's perspective, is that lots of oleic acid in your diet is not beneficial. Look at the mouse studies. It did not protect from obesity. Olive oil is not a great oil. It's not a unique oil. Animal fats are the things that have the nutrients we want in them. Animal fats are what are most valuable. Fire starter, tallow, however you can get it, animal organs, these are what is most valuable. I want to talk for a moment about fructose and fructolysis, because this is important biochemistry to understand when you're thinking about fruit consumption. If you look at the way that fructose versus glucose are processed in our cells, glucose comes into our cells and goes through a process called glycolysis. It becomes glucose 6-phosphate, fructose 6-phosphate, fructose 1,6-bisphosphate. So I just want you guys to know that there are isomers of fructose that are produced in human biochemistry without any fructose in our body. This is not a toxic sugar. When fructose comes in, it is converted to dihydroxyacetone phosphate and glyceraldehyde, but it goes into glycolysis at glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate, bypassing the rate-limiting step of glycolysis, which is phosphofructokinase, or PFK. So if we overconsume fructose, which is really something that would only happen if you were doing massive amounts of cola or processed sugar, you can get fructose to go through glycolysis unabated and form excess glycerol, form excess fats, form excess triglycerides, form excess VLDLs. Probably not the best thing, and it pushes down here through the glycolysis into pyruvate, acetyl-CoA, the Krebs cycle. But it's really important that we mention that in nature, it's actually pretty hard to overconsume fructose from natural sources. There is a sort of a decision fatigue, perhaps a better word is taste fatigue when you're eating fructose in nature. I think that the Hadza and other cultures eat a lot of honey, but it's only available seasonally. It's not available without, a sort of a limit on it. Fruit, definitely, if any of you guys have tried to eat a lot of fruit, last time I tried to eat a lot of fruit, my stomach just didn't feel good. It's pretty hard to overeat fruit. Now, soda and high fructose corn syrup, yeah, probably not good things. They're hijacking the mechanism here, and you can see how you could just push way more fructose into your body. But within normal, reasonable amounts, fructose is not harmful for humans, and that's been shown over and over. You don't need to fear fructose. It's not problematic. Listen to the podcast I did with Kurt, in which we were talking about our blood work. Kurt's uric acid is very low. My uric acid is very low, and I include fructose in my diet. I was eating a moderate amount of honey at the time, and my uric acid is not going to get raised. So fructose by itself does not cause gout, just like purines and organ meats do not cause gout in and of themselves. That's context dependent. That's what Western medicine misses, the context. Do not forget about the context. I mentioned this paper in this podcast. I've talked about it before. Tubers as a fallback food and their impact on Hadza hunter-gatherers. In this paper, they asked the Hadza what were their favorite foods. Both men and women said honey was their favorite food. Men said meat was their second. Women said that all meat, baobab, and berries were about the same. Baobab is a fruit. And then tubers were the least favorite for all of the people in this study, all the Hadza males and females, suggesting that hunter-gatherers don't love tubers. They'll eat them when they can get them, but they're a fallback food. One of the more interesting parts of this paper, they say if tubers are fallback foods, they should not be taken when more preferred foods are not available. So we investigated, and they found that indeed, when there is a kill, the Hadza women occasionally stop digging for tubers for 2 or 3 days when there's a lot of meat in camp. This is exactly what I said in the carnivore code, you guys. In the setting of animal meat and organs, even our hunter-gatherer ancestors will forego plant foods because they don't need them, because they are fallback foods. I'm not saying they're horrible for us. I'm not just saying they're not the ideal foods for humans. So make sure you get the ideal foods for you as a human. One other really cool paper I came across that talks about carnivory and human development, the impact of carnivory on human development and evolution revealed by a new unifying model of weaning in mammals. Basically, they say that carnivory appears to provide both a necessary and sufficient explanation as to why humans wean so much earlier than great apes, meaning that when you are eating meat, the breast milk is more nutrient dense, you can wean earlier, and that, they say, since early weaning yields shorter intervals between births and higher rates of reproduction with profound effects on population dynamics, our findings highlight the emergence of carnivory as a process fundamentally determining human evolution. And that is something that I have also said in the past many times. If carnivory determined our human evolution, eating meat and organs is written into who we are and should not be ignored. It's who we are. These are the things. We eat these diets. You avoid a diet of processed sugar, processed carbohydrates, processed seed oils, with processed seed oils being the most important piece of that. Don't overly throw the baby out with the bathwater in terms of all carbohydrates. Know which ones are less toxic. Tubers, probably okay. Squash, berries, honey occasionally, totally fine. Maybe even white rice. Apostasy, he says, you'll be fine. But get rid of the seed oils, because that really, over and over, in so many disease conditions, macular degeneration looks to be a problematic thing. If you had any doubt that animal fat is one of the most magical foods on the planet, I also want to share with you pentadecanoic acid. This is a C15 odd chain saturated fat, and it parallels broad associations in humans with health benefits. It's probably considered actually essential, but we don't make it, but it's in food. So further studies are needed to evaluate the potential impact of decades of reduced intake of odd chain fatty acid containing foods as contributors to C15 deficiencies and susceptibilities to chronic disease, what Chris and I were talking about. And what they find is that dietary odd chain saturated fatty acids are present in dairy fat, some fish, and animal fat, and higher circulating concentrations of OCFAs, pentadecanoic acid, and heptadecanoic acid are associated, again, it's association, but it's still valuable, with lower risks of cardiometabolic diseases and higher dietary intake of OCFAs associated with lower mortality. Now, where do we get odd chain fatty acids? Any guesses? Well, I probably wouldn't be sharing it with you if you didn't find it in animal fats. And there are some really cool studies that show this, that if you look in animal fats, in tallow, for instance, there is a good amount of odd chain pentadecanoic acid. So one more reason to eat tallow, to eat animal fat. And I'll show you guys this. differentiation of lard, chicken fat, beef fat, and mutton fat by GCMS, gas chromatography mass spec, EA-IRMS techniques. You can see here, if you look at the results for C15, beef fat and mutton fat, crush lard, there's essentially none in chicken fat. Beef fat and sheep fat, a lot of C15 pentadecanoic acid. Yet another reason to eat fire starter, to eat tallow, to eat animal fat, to eat animal organs, you guys. There's so much evidence that animal meat and organs are the centerpiece of the human diet. Do not fear these things and religiously eliminate the polyunsaturated fatty acids from your diet. So hopefully that all makes sense. All kinds of cool stuff. We talked about a lot. I love how it all comes together with the age-related macular degeneration. Chris is a master of the history. I love that. Let me know what you think of this podcast, you guys. Listen after. As always, I'll talk more after the podcast, what's going on with me. Check us out, Heart and Soil, heartandsoil.co. Whenever I end up hanging out longer than the guest, I'll tell you what I did that was most radical recently. So I've been shooting the bow a lot, and the most radical thing I did in the last day was go to Cabela's, which is an outdoor store here in Austin. I got some new camo, I got some new arrows, and I can't wait to go hunting in opening weekend, which is October the 3rd. So this is going to come out before October the 3rd, but the week of October the 3rd is also when Blood Builder and Histamine and Immune come out. Don't miss those. I was geeked about that in this podcast. I talked about the blood that's going to be in Blood Builder. Let me know if you have questions. You can always email me, Dr. Paul, drpaul, heartandsoil.co. That's all for today, guys. Keep hanging around if you want to hear what's going on with me after the podcast. Love you all. Stay radical. We're crushing it. All right, you guys, after every podcast, I talk about what is going on with me. Like I said, I just spent a few days at White Oak Pastures doing photography for the cookbook. That was really cool. We got some amazing photos, and I can't wait for you guys to see them in the near future. The cookbook's going to be a little bit because COVID is going to mess up the scheduling for the cookbook release. It'll probably be out in January 2022, but believe me, it will be worth it. The food photographs look out of this world. The photographs of me will be okay. The photographer is very talented and will do her best to make me look way more handsome than I really am, and I appreciate that mucho. But it was good to be there to see the cycle of life and death. I had this thought that I posted on Twitter about the fact that we are really just renting the atoms. We are renting the atoms that compose us, and our lease expires. And so they will soon be a part of something else. And they were a part of something else before they were your atoms. You are renting them. Do something radical with them. Remember who we are as humans. That, I think, is what we are all yearning for, is human connection, ancestral diets, nose to tail, all that good stuff. Thank you to my sponsors, heartandsoil.co. You know what we do. Bone marrow and liver, beef organs. Heart of the Warrior is coming, which is a super exciting one. We've got Blood Builder. We've got Histamine and Immune, Fire Starter, Gut and Digestion. So many exciting supplements, you guys. I just dropped a teaser. You guys have never heard of Heart of the Warrior, but it's coming soon. Didn't even really know I was going to say that, but I did. So you can email me and say, what is Heart of the Warrior, Paul? I heard about it on your podcast. We'll tell you what it is. And BlueBlocks, BLUBLOX.com, BelCampo.com, WhiteOakPastures.com. Carnivore MD gets you 15%, 10% off your first order, and 20% off your order, respectively, at those three fine establishments. You will be supporting the type of people doing good work in this world. Nutrisense.io and forceofnature.com are amazing as well. So every Sunday, I do an Instagram live at 4 p.m. Central, and sometimes I do it a little earlier. Stay tuned for changes. And yeah, that is that. I send my newsletter out on Sundays. Subscribe to that, heartandsoil.co. All the previous podcasts are at heartandsoil.co. Shoot me an email, Dr. Paul, drpaul, heartandsoil.co. If you have any questions, love you all. Stay radical. You are a part of the remembering, and I am grateful to call you all tribe.